we have a pretty exciting topic that's going to come next. It's going to be about Blazor and particularly how to develop cross-platform applications with Blazor. And we have an amazing speaker with us today, Lauren. Welcome here. It's super nice to see you.
Indeed, very nice to see you too, and I'm very happy to be here. A little bit last minute because time zone, are very difficult, and basically, but I'm here. I'm happy, and the weather outside is horrible, so I'm super happy to be here and to show you some stuff about Blazor, which is really a very exciting technology. So I'm quite happy that we have a chance to talk about that.
Yeah, and thank you so much for accepting and participating in our conference. And actually, for me, it's a particular joy because I myself am very into Xamarin development. And when I was kind of starting my career, you had a tremendous impact on that. And I have used MVVM Lite from old days, which kind of has already become a part of Microsoft stack. So
indeed,
it's very good to have you, and thank you so much for all of your contributions that you had so far.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm really happy that I was able to help you with that, definitely, and hopefully this will be interesting. Blazor is kind of a different beast, but I have to say I have a lot of fun programming Blazor, and MVVM Lite. It's just not suitable for these kind of things, but the concept of binding and basically everything that I put into MVVM Lite back then to make programming easier was actually Steve Sanderson, who is kind of the brains behind Blazor. I'm going totally off script here, so that's why I'm a little bit looking for my words, but essentially what I'm saying is Steve Sanderson was also very instrumental into bringing bindings to JavaScript, right? So you may remember a framework which was called Knockout.js. That's basically Steve Sanderson's brainchild. And later, Steve Sanderson was already working at Microsoft, and so later he basically put a lot of that knowledge and that good stuff into Blazor. And so you'll see that a lot of what we used to do in Xamarin, and before that Silverlight, and before that the S word, right, Silverlight, and then before that WPF, etc. You can actually program this way into Blazor as well, and it's actually very very comfortable, and so I like that.
Yeah, it's amazing to see that Blazor kind of is becoming what Silverlight had to become, and it's really cool to see that.
Yeah, somewhat. Yeah. It's funny because, of course, the comparison cannot not be made, right? I mean, you have to make this comparison. At the same time, of course, Silverlight was suffering from a lot of issues, and the biggest issue was definitely the fact that it was relying on a proprietary model, which needed a plugin to be installed.
Yeah.
Funnily enough, I stumbled on a page the other day which was still using Silverlight, and so I actually had to install the plugin. That was kind of funny. And of course, with Steve Jobs, not to name him, not wanting to have plugins on iPhones and iPads, etc., that pretty much killed the plugin model. It killed Flash. That's really what Steve Jobs was after. But as a side effect, it also killed Silverlight. And now that we have, and I'll talk about that in a moment, now that we have this fantastic WebAssembly concept, which is really native, right? I mean, it's built into the web browser, then you don't have that problem. And then your Blazor applications work just fine on phones, iPhone or other, without having to install anything, which is really nice.
Yeah, in this new world, it's very crucial to be very fast in your development, and I guess
indeed
that's why there are a lot of cross-platform frameworks coming up, and it's amazing to see that Microsoft actually has to offer several approaches, and Blazor is just one of them. So stage is yours, and I'm going to really enjoy the talk, and you can pick it up.
Perfect. Actually, I didn't start sharing my screen, so why don't I do this now? And this way, here we go. All right, like this, you can add my screen to the presentation. And so, dear friends, thank you so much for having me. So we were talking about Blazor, and indeed, I'm going to talk about Blazor. And the organizers asked me to kind of put a specific focus on cross-platform applications. So we'll talk about that. We'll see that basically Blazor, I would say almost from the start, is cross-platform because it really relies on components which are built into your web browsers. And you know, before we did mention Silverlight was running in a plugin, and now we don't have that plugin anymore. But basically, you could say that the web browser is the plugin if you want to be a little bit provocative. And this allows us, of course, to run those applications on pretty much any platforms that supports WebAssembly, which is really a lot. Like all modern phones will support WebAssembly, iPads, tablets, you know, these kind of things. Even some TVs who have Android operating system will run your WebAssembly applications. So of course that opens the door to a lot of things. All right, I don't have tons of slides because I really thought that I would show you some demos. Okay, so let's start by in Visual Studio creating a new project. Okay. And if you type Blazor here in the box, you will find a few things which are installed, notably a Blazor server application and a Blazor WebAssembly application, and then also the same one as empty. And we'll talk about that in a second. It's like an improvement that they made, where essentially if you create a Blazor server application or a Blazor WebAssembly application, you get tons of content which is already there. And I don't know if you're like me, but for me, when I start a new project, I kind of hate having to remove stuff. And eventually what I did is that I actually created a template, which was a Blazor empty application, which I was using for my projects. And now you don't have to do that anymore because they built that in. And so you can take advantage of that. So that's the only difference between a WebAssembly app and a WebAssembly app empty, is that in the empty one, you really have just like one page which says hello world, and that's pretty much it, right? While the server app and the WebAssembly app have something. Now, maybe let's talk quickly about server applications, because I want to put the focus today on WebAssembly, because it's kind of where it's, for my personal usage, more exciting. But nonetheless, you know, server application here is also a possibility to do Blazor. So the difference is that it looks very much the same, but for the server application, you're going to have your main logic in a web server, okay? And in fact, why don't I create one so that you can see that? So let's just create here a dummy one. You can choose .NET 6. If you have .NET 7 installed, you can choose .NET 7. You know that .NET 7 has been officially released in November 22, so you can absolutely choose it. The difference is that .NET 6 has a long-term support, which means that it will be supported for, I believe it's 3 years or something like that, while the .NET 7, as soon as .NET 8 is out, then .NET 7 becomes basically history, or kind of deprecated if you want. Still supported, but not with a long-term support like you have. Let's take .NET 6 just for the demo. And essentially what you're going to have here is that you're going to have you're going to deploy that to a web server, and then when you connect your client to the web application, to the web server, most of the rendering, or all of the rendering for that matter, is done on the server, and the rendering is communicated to the application via WebSockets, which is also a very fascinating technology, and we'll talk about that also in a moment in my demo. But basically, WebSockets communicate the changes to whatever you have in your application. So if you click a button, for example, that click will be communicated to the server and then back. This is really fast because WebSockets are really fast, but it's not local in your phone, okay? So if you want to do really some processing locally on your phone, you would rather choose the other solution, which is a WebAssembly one. And so if I choose here a WebAssembly application, again, it looks very, very similar, okay? Here, again, you can choose .NET 6, .NET 7. Let's create this. And it looks very similar in the structure. You notice that you also have this www root, which is where you have actually historically, this is where you have the web content if you do ASP.NET, right? And if I run this application, it's going to actually start my web browser, okay? Because this application runs in the web browser. And here we go. We have the sample application. So like I told you, if you choose the empty one, you don't have all this. And so what you're going to have is that if you go to counter, for example, and you click, all right, this is all local. There is no traffic going to the server. While if you choose a Blazor web server application, then the button will basically do something on the server, and then the change, this new count here will be communicated back to the application via WebSockets. So that's kind of the major difference between both. Originally, people were using the Blazor server applications more because they were more mature. That's kind of where they started, with the Blazor team started. But nowadays, the WebAssembly model is very mature, and personally, I prefer to use that because, again, I come kind of the Silverlight model, etc., in Xamarin, and I like to have my phones running locally. Or at least as locally as you can. Of course, you still need to serve this application, and we'll talk about that a little bit later, but essentially it's what you would call a static web application, right? Where everything runs here in the app. All right, so let's take a look at the way that this is organized. You have here some web content. So you have some CSS, okay? You have an image, an icon, an image. You have an HTML file, okay, interesting. And then you have some pages, and those pages are Razor pages. For those of you who are not familiar, Razor is a technology which is not directly linked to Blazor. It's actually linked to ASP.NET Core, where they started doing those Razor applications. Essentially, Razor applications are a page where you can mix HTML and C# code. Okay, so if I go to the counter, you see that I have here some HTML. And this is really standard HTML with some tricks, because here, for example, I have a page title. Now, page title is not typically something that you have in a standard HTML. So this is actually a Blazor component. So I can also add some, well, in that case, it's actually an ASP.NET Core component. So you can add also some ASP.NET component to that. You can add some Blazor component that you create. Think about user controls when we had, user controls in Silverlight, etc. You can mix your HTML, CSS, and then suddenly there is this at thing here. Now that's, as you may know in ASP.NET Core, that's typically how you add C# code, all right? So here we have a mix of actually HTML, and then there is an at which says, oh, the next statement here is going to be actually a call to a C# method. Okay, and the C# method is right there, so you can actually have your code directly in your HTML. That really reminds me of old school ASP. I don't know if we have some very old people on the call who remember classic ASP, where basically you are mixing your HTML and your VB, Visual Basic, okay, or JavaScript. Back then I was using JavaScript for these kind of things, and that was executed on the server. The difference here is that this code here will be executed on the client in the WebAssembly component, okay? Now, I don't like to have code in my HTML, or I don't like to have a lot of code, let's say. So what I usually do is that I will go to the pages here, and then the first thing I will do is add here a class. Okay, and this class, I'm going to call it counter. That's the same name, counter.razor, but then in addition, I will say .cs. Okay, and you see what Visual Studio does is that it's actually nesting those two components below each other. So it's a little bit like when we do XAML and we have the XAML and the XAML.cs. Okay, exactly the same thing. Now notice that I have a compiler error, and there is a reason to that. It's because when you have this counter.razor and you build your application, this code is actually going to end up into a class, which is called, guess what? Counter, just like you have here a class counter. And so you cannot have two classes named counter in the same namespace in your application. That's why the compiler is not happy. But thankfully, we have the partial keyword in C#, which means that now I'm saying, I know that you, compiler, have already created a class called counter, which is hosting whatever is needed for this page to work. It's actually hidden in the bowels of your application. But nonetheless, I want to also have my own definitions here. And so this is the other part of this page. So it's a way to split the class between two files. So now I can take this code here. Okay, I'm going to remove that statement here. Notice that immediately the compiler sees that something is wrong, which is really the main advantage, or one of the main advantages of using C# versus JavaScript. JavaScript would never detect something like that until you actually run the application, right? While here I have a compiler warning. I didn't even run the application, and already it's telling me something is wrong. And so if I go here to the page and add this, few things that I don't like into this code, I would probably, first of all, I'm going to do this public, all right? I will probably say, well, that should be a property, okay? So let's do a get set property here, all right? And when we do a property, you know, usually you want to have a name rule, right? You see, it should be uppercase character. So what I'm going to do is Control+. Then I'm going to say, well, actually, I cannot do that. I need to rename it first, okay, current count. Then I'm going to do Control+, and then I choose here rename. And the cool thing is that it renames here in the code, but it actually also went and renamed in the HTML code, okay, in the Razor code. So like this, you have a very nice way to basically use the Visual Studio refactoring tools, which is really nice. Another thing which is which you may notice is that here the onClick with, again, this at prefix, which means this is C# code. Here I don't need to change it because increment count, if it's, I didn't change the name, right? If it's down there in the code, or if it's down there in what you would call the code behind in XAML, essentially it doesn't make a difference, okay? The compiler is going to find it. So if I run this code now, and it always goes to the wrong window, sorry about that. If I run this code now, essentially, unsurprisingly, it works exactly the same, okay? Cool, so now what can we do to make things a little bit more interesting? Well, one thing we can do here is that we can add directives directly in the Razor application. So for example, I can say something like that. I can say here, if, oh, I'm in the wrong page, sorry about that. Here we go, I need to go into the counter page, okay? So here, I can say, all right, if the current count is greater or equal to 5, I want to show here a title saying success. And by the way, you see what happened? I was in the index.razor, I added code, and then it immediately, the compiler told me, oh, that cannot be right because current count is not known, which again, in JavaScript, I would have had to run the application, which is tricky. Here, the compiler helped me immediately. So let's say if, and you see there is this attribute here, at, which means this is going to be C# code, but oh, surprise, I do have some HTML code, which is mixed there. And this is absolutely legit. You can absolutely do that. So now I can say, all right, if the current count is greater or equal to 5, I need to show success. Let's see that. Okay, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, success. And this is how you can dynamically modify the content of your single page application by adding things like that. I'm not going to close the page here because I want to show you another feature which is nice. Here, I'm going to remove this code, and now I'm going to say something else. I'm going to make things a little bit more interesting, okay? You see, I can do some if then else. And here I say if the current count is greater than 10 or greater or equal to 10, I show another banner. And now I here modified the code. If I save and go back to my page here, well, in this case, it didn't work. You see, you have this button here, which is called hot reload, right? And hot reload is another feature which is really nice in Blazor and Visual Studio, is that you have basically a link between your application and Visual Studio. And if I click here, let me try to rearrange my window. If I click here on hot reload, it's actually going to reload. You see the small check mark which came up here, means that my code has been automatically reloaded. And now if I go to 10, you see it changes. I didn't have to count back from 5 again because it kept the state, but it applied my code changes. Okay, so the hot reload button is really very useful when you work here in Blazor. Okay, now a few things you could do. You could say, all right, I want to do for var. Oops, sorry, my IntelliSense is in the way here. For var index equals 0 to 5. index plus plus, and then say something like add, I don't know, let's say an h4 with, for example, with the index. And so you see, when I want to reference my C# variable here, I use the at prefix here, and like this, that's going to work. So now if I refresh, okay, in this case, it had to actually reload the application. So sometimes the hot reload requires to actually refresh the application. And here you see it does from 0 to 4. It counts from 0 to 4, like I said. So like this, you can build, I don't know, tables. Okay, we don't really use tables in HTML anymore, but nonetheless, we still use them. You can build, you know, things with rows, right? You can add multiple divs, etc. You can build a nice grid if you want, all like this in HTML directly. Now, another thing which is really cool is that you can also interact. So you have to think about that as a component which is hosted in the web browser in an HTML file, which is the index.html that we have here. So one thing that you can do, which is very useful, is that you can actually even invoke some JavaScript, okay? So one thing here I can say is, I'm going to count, and then I'm going to say, if the current count is greater or equal to 15, I want to change the title of my HTML web browser. You see, that's interaction. That's what we call interoperability, right? I want to set the title to the count. So I want to change the title dynamically. Now, changing the title from here from Blazor is potentially possible, but it's really easy to do from JavaScript. So how do I actually do that? Well, one thing you can do is, first of all, I need this JS runtime component. And you see the compiler doesn't like it. It says, well, I have no idea what that is. Oh, also, in that case, I'm actually awaiting because this is an invoke void async. So I'm going to have to change this to async void, okay? Why async void and not async task? Because this is actually an event handler, okay? So actually, I'm not sure if that would work. Interesting. Okay. Anyway, invoke void, you know, async void, you should never use async void except when it's an event handler. So I'm going to keep it this way. So now the error change, it says JS runtime does not exist, and this is correct. Which brings us to how do you actually inject stuff into your page. And the cool thing is that you can do that here in your page directly. You can inject whatever components you need. It could be an HTTP client. It could be other things. So here, I'm going to say, all right, I want to inject, all right? And then this is going to be an IJS runtime, JS for JavaScript. So basically, I'm injecting the JavaScript runtime interoperability component, and I'm going to call that JS runtime. And now that I have injected it, if I go back, now the compiler is happy and knows about it. Still not happy totally because invoke void async is actually an extension method. So I'm going to add here using Microsoft.js interrupt, and this is going to make the compiler happy, okay? However, this is going to call a JavaScript method or a JavaScript function, which at the moment doesn't exist. So I need this function called setTitle, and then I'm going to give it a parameter. Where do I actually define this function, this JavaScript function? Well, I'm going to have to define it in the host of this whole thing. And the host is this index.html. So if we take a look at this index.html here, now this is code that most of the time you don't modify or barely modify. You are going to have something saying loading. This is what's going to be shown when your application is loading, when the WebAssembly component is not there yet. And then when it's ready, you see it says div id equals app. The component of this app div is going to be replaced by whatever you have in your Razor page, okay? Actually, it's a little bit more complicated than that because there is here a shared component with a main layout. So here you can also modify the layout of your application. And then where you have the @body, that's actually where the content of your Razor page is going to be shown. So you have this layout, and then inside the layout, you're going to have the code that you're working on. And here's the layout. Again, you can modify it if you want. Because it's shared, it's going to be applied to every page Unless you want to change that, you can also modify that. I'm not going into the detail here because it's a little bit out of the scope of the presentation, and I have tons of things to show you, so I don't want to spend too much time on that. But basically, check out the layout system. All right, so now I have my injection. I have the call. So now I need this method called setTitle. So I'm going to go into my index.html. You notice also that this is where the CSS is included, right? And now I'm going to take my script and I'm going to put it here. And when this function called setTitle is called, I'm going to set the document.title. So basically, I'm here inside the HTML DOM, and then that's going to change the title. So let's see if this works out. Running the application. Where is my application? It should be here. I'm just going to reload to be sure. Okay. Now if I click, I go to 5. I go to 10. And now if I click to 15, notice here it says counter. Now it says 15. Now it says 16, 17, etc. So I have interoperated with JavaScript. You can also interoperate in the other direction from JavaScript. You can invoke stuff on your Blazor application. I never had the need to do that. Mostly what I want is there is things that I do in Blazor which would be easier to do in JavaScript, and so I'm sending this call to JavaScript to do things in JavaScript, such as, for example, changing the title of the window or doing other things. But most of the time, most of my code actually stays in Blazor and in C#, okay? So that's kind of a whirlwind tour of that. Another thing I wanted to show you very quickly is the routing. Here in this page, you say it says @page equals @page and nothing, and then just @counter. If I go to index, it's going to say @page slash, okay, and nothing else. This is how you say in the web browser how the navigation works. So if I start here on index, okay, you see I have localhost, and then nothing. So basically this is an empty path, an empty route. It brings me to index. But if I add here /counter, it's going to navigate to the correct page, which is counter. Notice that if I do that here, there is no refresh of the window, while if I do that here, there is actually a refresh of the window. So that's a caveat to take care of when you do routing, that the window here is going to be refreshed. But it is interesting nonetheless, because it allows you to give a direct link to a page which is maybe a little bit deeper into your application, okay? Good, so that was kind of the introduction, the crash course in Blazor, if you want. And based on that, you can already start building apps, which is fun. Another application type that we have, and I'm not sure if I can actually show that. Let me try this one. Okay, so yeah, so this application here, now I cannot run it. This is another application. It looks very similar, and that's actually on purpose. But the thing which is cool is that this is actually a MAUI application, okay? And the MAUI application, what it means is that if I go to properties, you see I have iOS targets, I have Android targets, I have Windows targets, and I have Tizen targets. And what it means is that when I went into my Visual Studio here, there is also a MAUI application with Blazor. And for those of you not familiar with MAUI, I don't want to say the words, but it's kind of the successor to Xamarin, if you want. That's kind of where Xamarin is going now, okay? And so this is going to build a cross-platform application, which you can then deploy. The previous application I showed you, I need to serve it from a web server, okay? Or a static web app in Azure or whatever. I'll show you that in a second. But basically, I need something to serve it. While here, this application is actually going to be built and deployed directly to the App Store in iOS, or, well, I mean, you have to, of course, submit it to the App Store or to the Android Play Store. And then when you install it on your phone, it's actually it's actually an actual Xamarin or if you want Android/iOS application. Okay, but it uses under the hood, it uses also Blazor. So it's an alternative to the standard MAUI applications where you would use XAML and C#, where here, instead of using XAML and C#, you use Blazor as your UI. This can be a nice alternative if you have existing HTML applications that you want to port into an actual application, where you have already some HTML code and you want to convert that to Blazor, for example. So that's kind of the possibilities you have. Now, those Blazor applications can also be deployed as a PWA, which is a progressive web application, which is also a way to kind of taking a web application and packaging it as a standalone app. So you see that you have tons of possibilities to do things if you want. But I would say the Blazor app deployed to a web server is probably what you have the most right now. And then the MAUI with Blazor can be also an interesting alternative. So here I have another application that I want to show you, which is also interesting. And mostly, let's ignore this component. But basically, this and this is what I'm going to give you the the URL to the GitHub repo in a moment. I have here a chat server, which is a function application. Okay, so here I have two functions. I have negotiate and talk. And here I have my Blazor client, which is going to connect to this application. Now, this one is actually the same client, but except it's implemented in JavaScript and HTML. So here you see I have some JavaScript code, which is doing the connection and everything. Well, I took a moment and then I ported that to C#. So it's kind of interesting if you go to the repo, and I'm going to give you the repo later, to compare how you can do things in JavaScript. In that case, I was using Vue, or how you can do things in Blazor. But in the end, the result is the same. So you can choose what you're more, what you're more familiar with, more comfortable with. Okay, for me, I'm more comfortable in C#. I usually do small web applications with JavaScript, but as soon as it gets more complicated, I kind of like having C#. So this application, what it's going to do, it's going to do a chat. It's going to basically use SignalR. I'm not going too deep into SignalR, but SignalR is a way to use WebSockets for communications, okay? And so what I'm going to do is that I'm going to call here. You see this method called connect. So the way that it works, everything starts here in either on initialize async or on after render async. After render async is this event is called when your page is rendered. And it's called multiple times. Every time there is a change in the UI, this method is going to be called. But if this is a first render, I'm going to do something here. I'm going to ask the user for their username. And you see what I'm doing? I'm doing, again, a JS runtime invoke async. Okay, before I was doing invoke void async because I was just setting the title. I didn't care about the return value. But now I'm interested in the return value, which is the username of the person. And so somewhere I have a method, a function, to be precise, a JavaScript function called askUsername. Why did I do that in JavaScript? It's because I'm lazy and I'm using a good old prompt. That's like the 1980s or 1990s, maybe calling back, right? So I'm using a good old JavaScript prompt, which says, please enter your name. And then I return that. And through the magic of interoperability, my username property, which is now a C# property, is going to be set. When this is done, I'm going to call connect, all right? And connect, what it's going to do is that it's going to call a function, an Azure function this time. So it's going to go using HTTP, all right? Using an HTTP client. It's going to connect here to this function called negotiate. And what negotiate is doing, negotiate is going to call my SignalR service, and this SignalR service is going to return whatever is needed to connect through WebSockets. Then after that, when this is done, I have all the information I need to build a SignalR connection, a WebSocket connection. So I'm going to be listening to messages on the WebSocket. I need an access token, which is going to be given to me from the negotiate method. I have a URL, and then I'm going to say every time that you receive something called new message, I want you to call this receive new message method, okay? And then I'm going to start the connection. So now I have what happens when you receive a message. Now in my index, I have a form, and you see that I'm using an edit form. It's not a conventional HTML form. If you want, it's a conventional HTML form, but with added feature. So I have this edit form, and basically my code here, I'm going to have here a title. I'm going to say, if I'm not ready yet, I'm going to show a loading message. This ready here, it's a property. If I use F12, I can actually navigate to the property, okay? Ready is going to be false when I start. So in the beginning, I'm just going to show this loading div. Else, when I'm ready, I'm going to show hello username, which I have collected from the user. Again, there is this at prefix here. Then I'm going to show here a form, which is going to say enter your message, and this is bound. You see, I'm using data binding here. This is bound to this property called model.newMessage. So model is an object that I have here, and within the model, I have this property called newMessage. So like this, I can data bind in JavaScript, sorry, in Blazor, in Razor here, to something. Why did I use bind and not value equals? I could actually go and do value equals. Okay, is that the same? Let me see. I could do something like that. I could do model.newMessage, okay? Now, if I do that with a value, this is actually a single way binding. So it means that changes that you do here are not going to be communicated back to your property. When you use the typical way of doing things in Blazor is to call bind-value, okay, with a small v here. And bind-value is going to do a two-way binding. But you use bind-value so often that you can also do a shortcut like that. Then I have here a bind colon event. And what it does is this is an attribute or a property of the binding, if you want. You see, it's not bind dash something, which would be like, okay, this is an object per se. But here I have colon. The colon means I'm going to configure the binding to be on input. On input means every time that I type something, the binding is going to be updated. Okay. You could have also different things here, which is going to modify how the binding is updated. Okay. And then I have here this method, this event. You see, this is an HTML event on key press. Okay. But because I add the at prefix, it means that suddenly I have here, I can enter some C#, and this form key pressed, that's going to be an event handler, which is going to check if my key is enter. And if this is enter, I'm going to send the new message. It's because I want to be able to type a message, press enter, and then it's going to be sent. So that's kind of my UI. And then after that, I have a for each. Very convenient to build HTML using a for each. I have here this messages, that's a list of message. So that's where every time I receive a message, I'm going to add it into this list of message. And then automatically my HTML code is going to be updated because Blazor is going to detect, hey, there is a change in this collection. Notice this is not an observable collection like we would have in XAML. This is a plain old stupid list. But again, Blazor does some magic and add all kinds of collection change attributes, etc., so that you don't have to do it yourself. So this is kind of nice in Blazor. So I can now basically loop through my collection, and for each message, I'm going to add a new row with an HR, and then with here the name, the message.names are going to be the name of the sender of the message, and then the text of the message. Long story short, I can actually run this locally. So I'm going to start here my function application. This function application, I'm not totally local because I need the Signal R service. So somewhere in Azure, let me see if I can show you that. Somewhere in Azure, I have a Signal R service, which is sitting here. and which is waiting for input. This signal out service is a standalone service. It's running here. You see that right now it's not doing much. If I check 1 day, 7 days, okay, now I have some activities. This is probably when I was preparing the demo, okay. 30 days, well, not much, but basically there is some activity here, not super much, but basically it is here, it is there. And I have here on the keys, I actually have a connection string, which I need. So here in my function application, I have specified here the connection string. So basically I'm going to be listening and connecting to this signal out service. So that's my function application. When I deploy this to Azure, it's going to run in Azure, but right now it is sitting here on my desktop. Then I'm going to start here the chat client here. Okay, I'm going to start it. Now you missed okay, let me just refresh that so you see this is a prompt that is coming from JavaScript. Okay, I can enter my name, Laurent, and now it's going to, if I check in F12 what happened, this is probably not relevant here, but basically it connected to my function. So if I check what happened here in the network, let's do it again. Okay, so let's check here what happened in the network. The first thing that happened is that we downloaded a few things. We downloaded the blazor.webassembly.js. We downloaded, this is really the main JavaScript files that we need, okay? After that, we have a few things. We have a .NET.702.js. So this is also kind of the link between the actual .NET, which is going to run in the WebAssembly, and basically your HTML, right? So that you have this link going on between your JavaScript code, which is running here, and your .NET code, which is running in the WebAssembly. The hot reload thing, this is just to facilitate the hot reload functionality in Visual Studio, so it's not relevant here. One thing I wanted to show you, and I hope it's going to work, otherwise I have a screenshot. If I go to, let's say I go to a new profile. I have never been to this profile with this application before. And I'm going to open the DevTools and show you here the network. And now I'm going to go and connect. Now you see what happens. Let me enter my name. Let's call this other window, okay? You see what happened is that it downloaded a bunch of DLLs. Now that is interesting because this is what is taking time in Blazor. When you start your application the first time, it's going to have to download some DLLs, okay? And in that case, it's really bad because I'm using the development, I'm basically running in debug mode, which means that it's downloading tons of things. And some of them are pretty big. You see, I have, well, I mean, I guess 60 kilobytes these days is not that big anymore, but some of them, I don't know if I can sort by, yeah, I can sort by size. Here, you see, I have 1.3 megabytes, okay? I have 1.1 megabytes. Those are DLLs. I have the WASM runtime, which is 1 megabyte. And so you may wonder, okay, so do I really want to do that, right? I mean, in JavaScript, you don't download anything. JavaScript is kind of there. You just download your code, but you don't have a framework to download. So a few things about that. The first thing is that the next time I go, it's not downloading anymore because it has cached those DLLs. Okay, so that's the first thing. Second thing, the first run is going to take longer. That's true. But the second thing is that when you go here and you go into release mode, it's going to do an additional pass in the building, which is linking. It's going to remove from those DLLs everything that you don't need. And then it's going to send to WebAssembly only the strict minimum, which means that the size of your application can be tremendously smaller when you run it in release mode compared to the debug mode. Okay, I hope it makes sense. I don't see your reactions. Actually, I don't know if I can see the comments. Yeah, I have a few things here, but no comments. But if you have questions, just put them in the comments. I'll keep an eye on that. But basically, you see, that's kind of the trick, is to say, oh my God, you download a lot of things. And this is true. The main difference between, the main disadvantage of Blazor versus JavaScript is that you're going to have to download this code, this compiled code, these DLLs. But again, the way that it's stripped down makes it actually acceptable for modern computing. Now, obviously, if you're in a place where you only have 3G or 2G network, there are still some places like that. I was recently in the mountains of the Philippines, for example. You barely have connections there. Then, of course, every byte counts, and maybe this is something you want to think about, okay? So keep that in mind. Nonetheless, the cool thing is that now, if I show you this application, I'm going to put, do I still have the other one open? No, I don't have it. So I'm going to just open them side by side. Oh, actually, I do have it. Here it is. Okay. And now what I can do is say, this one, oh, both of them are called Lohun. This is stupid. Let's refresh. And okay, so this one is called Other. This one is called Lohun. And here, if I type hello Lohun and I send, you see the chat works in both directions. And again, this is powered by WebSocket, which means it's very fast. Now, of course, it's not very interesting to talk to myself, okay? So I probably don't want to do that. So at some point, I want to deploy that to Azure. And the good news is that deploying that to Azure is very simple, and it's also very cheap. To do that, what you can use, because this is actually a static web application, okay? This is a static, we call them, the name escapes me now. Single page application, SPA, okay, SPA, single page application. So when you have a single page application, and I created one for the demo here, actually I have two. I have one for my Blazor client, and I have one for the conventional JavaScript client. So if I go here, this static web application is going to be extremely cheap, or in this case, it's even free to run because I'm using it for demo purpose. If you use it for a hobby, for example, that would be free. So how do you create such an application? Well, first of all, you're going to go into the Azure portal. You're going to click on the plus, okay? And then you're going to type here static web app. And then you select here the component, you'd say create. Then you have to enter a few things. For example, I'm going to say, where do I want to deploy it? I'm going to deploy it to my demo subscription. What resource group do you want to deploy it to? In that case, I have a resource group which is called chat server, or you could create a new one. This is just a grouping of the things. And then you need to enter a name. So I'm just going to call it .NET Conf. And then it checks that the name is available, okay? And then here, this is what I was telling you. You have different plans. You can say, if it's for hobby or personal projects, it's actually free to use. We give you that resource. If you want to have more performance or more features, you can use a standard one. If I compare the plans, the standard one is going to cost me for enterprise grade edge, right? Which is really like the best of all the tiers we have, only $6 per month, okay? $6 per month. If I go with the general purpose one, it's $3 per month, $3.3 per month. So the main difference is really that you can have more custom domains because we give you custom domain even in the free tier. SSL certificates are always free. We are not going to charge you for that, and we renew them ourselves. So it's running in HTTPS always. Here you will have custom authentication that you can use. So you can have basically, if you want your users to be able to authenticate, then you need the paid tier. But again, the paid tier is pretty cheap, right? $3 per month is not too bad. Also, the application size is going to be bigger. So you want to create your application. I'm going to choose free here. I'm going to choose Western Europe because that's where I'm based. And then to actually load your application, you're going to say, where is the code? So we support continuous integration straight from the box here. My code is in GitHub. It is into my own account. It is in the repository called chat server. No, it's called, what is it called now? Oh, sample dash function signal R, okay? And then the branch, if you have multiple branches, you can actually choose which branch you want to deploy. In that case, I want to deploy main, okay? And then you're going to say, how do I build the code? Because this code is going to be built by the GitHub action. So this is a very nice thing. Every time you make a change and you push to main, it's going to deploy automatically. So I'm going to choose Blazor here. And now I need to say, where is my code? So let's go to the repo. And this repo, you're going to get it in the last slide. Okay, so this is a repo here. In this repo, I have here chat client Blazor. And inside chat client Blazor, this is where I have the CS project, the C# file. So I'm going to take this and I'm going to say, that's where I have my client location, my application location. This is the client side. But then I also have the possibility to deploy the functions to that. And that's the beauty of it. Those static web apps are basically split between client and also an API component. You don't have a web server. It's not a full-blown web server where you do things like you cannot deploy an ASP.NET application to that. But Blazor being a client application, a single-page application, it can be served from here, and then you can have an API component. And so this API component, in that case, that the two functions that I had, which are into chat server. Okay. And output location, I set it to www root, which is the standard. So now if I review and create that, I just want to show you what happens. We're not going to wait for it to complete because I'm almost at the end of my presentation, but I just want to show you. If you see it says deployment is in progress, that's the deployment of the static web application. It takes a few seconds to deploy, so I'm just going to give it a second so that you can see what's going on. Now the static web application is ready. But of course, if I navigate to it, it has nothing yet. It's because in addition to everything it did, it created in my repository a new action. And this action is now busy building and deploying the job. And the beauty of it is that every time I am going to make a change to the main branch, which is what I configured, it's going to build and deploy. So you have continuous integration directly built into that. Now, of course, I don't want to wait for this to complete. I actually already deployed this chat client Blazor application, all right? So one thing you can do, if you want to try it out, first of all, let's run it. Okay, enter your name. So I'm Loho, boom. It's going to connect to my functions. Now it's connected. And because I don't want to be chatting just with myself, I'm going to close this here. And here I have, where is it? Here I have somewhere, no, this is not the one. Too many things. Here I have a QR code. So what I would like you to do is go and scan this QR code with your phone. Okay, I'm going to do that myself just to check if it's working. That's going to load this chat application in your phone. Remember, this is actually Blazor, which is running, okay? And now you have Blazor running in your phone. And if I enter a message here, actually I enter a message from my phone, for example, hey, all right, enter. You see that my phone sends a message to my web browser. So basically I built a cross-platform application using HTML, JavaScript, but also C#, right? So this is the beauty of WebAssembly. It runs in the phone and those applications are going to run there similarly. I don't see anybody. Ah, here we go. Yes, Kaik. Nice. And David is here as well. So you see that it is running as well. You have been able to connect. And now, because of the magic of Blazor, you have actually WebAssembly, C# code, .NET code running in your phone, okay, which is really beautiful. Again, remember the alternative, if you don't want to have to build a static web app for that, if you want to have a really pure Android or iOS application running in there, you can also use .NET MAUI with Blazor, and that's going to run, okay? Perfect. So I'm going to send you a message. So hello, everyone. And like this, you see that it works. Cool. So again, in the slides, and I'll give you the slide, there is also some information about Timekeeper. So what is Timekeeper? And I'm going to finish with that. Timekeeper is an application where I pushed what I'm showing you further. And essentially, I'm using this application when I do some interviews online. We have sometimes some interviews, or when I want to keep track of time with my guests on the stream or wherever. In this case, Unfortunately, Wang passed away from cancer already. Oh my God, it's been like already a year and a half, I believe. I miss him every day, or even more than that, I think. But when I interviewed him, the problem I had is that I told him, hey, you have 5 minutes, right, for the interview, which is really short. And you don't interrupt somebody like Abel by saying, oh, that's all the time we have, right? So Timekeeper is going to help me with that. It's going to keep track of time. It's going to keep everyone synchronized, if you want, during a meeting, etc., so that everybody knows what's going on. And the way that it works is that, again, this is a Blazor application using Signal R under the cover. You see when I start the clock here in the host window, it's going to start the clock in the guest window as well. And the clocks are synchronized. If I stop one and start another one, that's how it works. Very nice application to use. It's, of course, under the cover, a little bit more complicated than that. Another thing you can do also is give a message to the guest. For example, if suddenly you say, oh, you're running out of time, right, which I think David is going to tell me very soon, then you can also send a message. The new version that we have now, you can also show some polls. So here, this is good when you want to ask something from your users. Here, the host can publish a poll, and then the guest can go and answer. And you see the host now sees who voted and if they voted correctly or not. And then they can close the vote when they are done. Also a very nice feature that we use. And finally, the last feature we have is a simple chat, which is, of course, super convenient when you want to quickly have a private chat. Like here, I'm actually talking to you through StreamYard. I can use the private chat in StreamYard. But if I go, if I don't want to use StreamYard, or if I want to have a different chat method, I can use the chat here. So Timekeeper is nice. And also the cool thing with Timekeeper is that this is using exactly the same features. And in fact, if you go to timekeeper.cloud, okay, timekeeper.cloud, I just noticed I didn't put that into the slide, so I'm going to put it now here, and then I'll give the slide to David so you can have it. If you go to timekeeper.cloud, it's going to show you a demo video. It's going to allow you to log in. There is actually no login. If you can actually also have authentication and everything, but here I disabled it because I want everybody to be able to use that. You see that it's taking a moment to load. It's because there are some functions behind. So of course this is serverless. A lot of people are already using it and doing some tests. And then you can go and do a new session, .NET conf, create. And when the session is created, then you can go and define your clocks and, for example, say what happens when people are reaching the end of the clock, etc., etc. So basically, you can use Timekeeper for free to try it out, or even if you want to run a conference or run a demo or run something. So that's quite convenient to use. Okay, the code for Timekeeper, if you go to About, it's going to be on GitHub, of course. This is a public repo. Everybody can check it out. And in there, you have the code. The connection and everything is exactly like the code that I showed you. The other code that I want to share with you, and this is, by the way, the code which is here, all right? This QR code here. If you go to that address, this is where you have the chat application. And inside there, you're going to be able to see the chat server, which is the function application, the Azure function application. You have the chat client Blazor, which is a Blazor application. And then you have also the same code, but except it's written in JavaScript with HTML and with Vue.js. And this is what you have here. Okay, so hopefully this was helpful to you and you understand a little bit better what this is all about. Quickly and super quickly, because honestly, I didn't really have time to check it out much. You know that .NET 7 has been released in November, right? The way that .NET works, and also Blazor, is that we release a new version of .NET every year, always, like a full version of .NET, always in November. That's during the .NET Conf, which is taking place online, streamed from Seattle and all over the world, okay? So .NET 7 has been released in 2022. .NET 8 is going to be released in 2023 November. We already know that, okay? What we don't know is what's going to be inside it. .NET 7 has been released, okay? That's the current version. .NET 6 is a long-term support version, meaning that if you have really a project well, you want to have this long-term support, you'll probably want to use .NET 6. But if you want to have the latest and greatest, that's .NET 7. In Blazor, there are a bunch of enhancements, new components. The hot reload is way better. You see the debugger has been improved. So all the code I showed you, you can actually debug. You can put a breakpoint, press F5 to run it. It's going to open your web browser, click on the button, and poof, you're into Visual Studio. So you can debug. This is very nice. Hot reload is improved. The binding, there's a grid component now, which is very convenient. Also, you know that data grids are always painful to build. Enhancement to the binding. For example, you can say you want to bind, you want to change the value, but only after a certain method has been executed. So it's kind of a pre-validation of your value if you want. You can also split the get and the set for your binding. So you can say, all right, I want to do something else. It's not just binding to a property, but I want to do something when the value is changed. So a bunch of things. And I'm just going to go quickly through that. Basically, if you want to know more about ASP.NET Core, and Blazor is a part of ASP.NET as a project. So if you want to know more, you can go there, ak.ms/ASP.NET/7. And of course, Steve Sanderson is a good person to follow on GitHub because he's the main project manager behind Blazor. So if you go to github.com/Steve Sanderson MS, that's where you will find him. For myself, if you want to find me, you can go on my GitHub, Elbunion, Twitter, Elbunion, LinkedIn, Elbunion. And this is, again, the repo where you have all the code. Thank you so much for your attention. I hope it was useful to you. I'm maybe a little bit over. Sorry about that. But I think we started a little bit late. So hopefully you have a fantastic day. I don't know if there are any questions or anything, but up to you, Gagi.
Thank you so much, Lauren. It was so much information packed into 1 hour. Like, I don't imagine how you were able to deliver this. So thanks for that. I
talk fast. That's the secret.
yeah. So I do have a couple of questions, actually.
Yeah,
Blazor is actually a lot of things. So you can do like WebAssembly apps. You can have Blazor server, and now you can also have like Blazor MAUI running like native applications on your mobile. So is Blazor something that could, for instance, potentially replace Electron JS, which we all know like kind of Teams has been built by Electron JS. So in this brightest future, I would imagine that we would use .NET technologies to build like cross-platform desktop apps Electron allows.
Well, you know, I mean, it's always tricky with tech, right? I mean, first of all, nothing ever dies. Right? Like I told you, I was the other day online and I saw the Silverlight page, okay? Nothing ever dies. And so replacing, it's kind of a concept which is tricky. So I guess there might be still some feelings that Blazor is a Microsoft proprietary technology, which can be, for some people, in the way of adoption, right? Like people don't like to use proprietary tech. And I don't blame them. I mean, I can understand why, right? While Electron being open source, but of course, Electron has also a lot of disadvantages. Most notably, it's heavy and it's slow, right? I mean, I think if you used it, you know, that's my main gripe with Teams. Teams is kind of it's not bad, right? As a enterprise application for sure, but yeah, sometimes it just hangs and etc. So of course, Blazor is way faster because WebAssembly is way faster than anything you can do in JavaScript, right? That's for sure. So there are advantages and disadvantages to both. I would say, I think it has the potential of being something really big. Yeah, I mean, if people start adopting it, my main guidance for people who tell me, okay, should I just like leave behind my JavaScript code and go full into Blazor? I would say if you have a team which is experienced with .NET, it might make sense. If you have a team which is experienced with JavaScript, and then you have to start and, you know, train them into .NET, then probably it doesn't quite make sense. Yeah. A few things which are really nice is that you can actually share code between your client component and your server component, right? So when I have my function application, all the data objects that I'm sending via JSON are shared between my client and so that's kind of the beauty of C#, right? Is that you can do that. if I do that in JavaScript, in JavaScript, I have to kind of, I have to get the JSON, which is easy to do in JavaScript at least, but then I have to infer that, I have this property and this property, and it's a little bit tricky. So there are a lot of advantages to having the same tech on the client and the server. Again, we did that with Silverlight. I even did that back then with ASP, where I was running JavaScript on the client and the server. So the same tech is kind of nice. And of course, the nice thing with Blazor is really the development with Visual Studio is so much easier than writing JavaScript, because the compiler support is just so beautiful, right?
Yeah.
So now, if you tell me, but we are doing TypeScript, then of course that kind of, it makes sense. Yeah, TypeScript is going to give you compiler support. So, this is a typical answer. It depends, right? It depends a lot on your team. It depends a lot on what you want to achieve. Yeah.
And you mentioned actually code sharing, and my next question was going to be about that. So I was mentioning that I want to do an experiment and try to build an app that will run on mobile, desktop, and web platforms with just .NET technologies. And in mobile and desktop, like MVVM is the way to go. Like it allows you to do this code sharing, nice isolation of your logic and your views. Could you actually share some of the view models if you do not bind them directly to MAUI like controls, and you do like a pure .NET MVVM? Could you reuse those view models with Blazor WebAssembly application?
Yeah, absolutely. And the nice thing with Blazor, again, like I tell you, Steve Sanderson is a genius, right? I mean, you can quote me on that. This guy is very clever. What they do is that basically they use really MVVM, right? I mean, it's a model view model, except or architecture, except that you don't have kind of the overhead of MVVM that we had. When you do MVVM and you have those property changed things that you need to raise your events, those collection change, etc., and the commands, right, and all that, it's kind of in the way. So this is not necessary in Blazor. What you do is that basically you bind directly to a property, and under the cover, you are going to observe this property. You bind directly to a collection. It can be a list, a simple list, right? It doesn't need to be an observable collection, and then you have that. For the method call, same thing. You don't need the command. You just call the method. So it's kind of what a lot of what MVVM Lite and now the MVVM toolkit, etc., are trying to achieve, are making it easier to use MVVM as an architecture, right? So here in Blazor, it's kind of built into Blazor. And when you use the @bind value, for example, then you have a two-way binding, which is already there, even if your property is not observable by default. So it's actually very, very convenient. And that means, of course, that your plain old, we call them plain old C# object, right? POC. So plain old C# object, your POCO, exactly. Basically, they can live in an assembly. In a class library, and then you can share this class library between multiple places. My recommendation is always the same when you build cross-platform applications. Of course, in Blazor, since the front end is HTML, you can also use dynamic HTML. So you can use media, a CSS component to change the view, etc. But after a certain point, it kind of makes sense to have maybe a different UI. So I like to share as much as I can from my business logic, and then the UI, I'm going to decide, depending on the project, to maybe have a different project for that, and then just use the class library. Or if you do really advanced CSS and you're good with CSS, it can be also possible to use just dynamic HTML.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you so much, Laurent. I really enjoyed the talk, and I believe everybody did. And thanks for allotting some time and helping us and being a part of Conf Armenia. We really hope to see you again. Have a really nice rest of the day. And
next time in person.
yeah, we hope so.
That would be nice. Yeah, I would love to come and visit you. One of my very good friends is Armenian, lives in Zurich here. And every time he shows me pictures, I'm dying because your country is so beautiful.
Yeah,
so I really want to go in the mountains.
Come here. Yeah, it is a very beautiful place to be in.
Yeah, I would love to come. So definitely we'll plan that for next year. All right. Thank you so much for having me. See you soon. Bye-bye.
Bye.